You may have noticed, at certain moments in your life, that something curious happens right at the edge of collapse. A tension that has been tightening for years suddenly trembles, as if it knows it cannot hold itself together much longer. And rather than loosening, it tightens even more. The mind becomes louder. The emotions become sharper. The sense of I becomes fiercely protective, almost desperate. It is in these strange moments, just before release, when the ego fights hardest. And that is because the ego, you see, is not a thing. It is a story. It is a movement. It is a trembling pattern of resistance, a particular dance of thought and memory trying its absolute best to remain the center of the universe. And a story, my friends, does not quietly allow itself to come to an end. Imagine for a moment that you are drifting off to sleep. Your body becomes heavy, your breathing softens, and consciousness begins to loosen its grip on the day. Just as you're about to fall into that warm and gentle darkness, there is often a sudden jolt, a twitch, a startle, a little spark of panic as if something inside you is shouting, "Wait. Not yet." This is the ego's last flare of defiance. It senses that the boundaries it so carefully constructed are dissolving, and so it fights to preserve itself, like a candle flickering violently just before it goes out. Now, consider how this same pattern appears in daily life. When a person is losing control of a situation, do they not become more controlling? When a relationship is ending, do we not often cling to it the hardest? When someone's beliefs are challenged, do they not defend them with increased ferocity? This is what it looks like when the ego fears its own dissolution. You see, the ego is not your enemy. But it is not your master either. It is more like a little actor who has forgotten that it is acting. It believes so strongly in its role that any hint of improvisation, or worse, any suggestion that the play might end, is met with tremendous resistance. And so, when the ego grows loud, when it becomes dramatic and tense, when it insists that everything must be held together by force, it is usually because it feels the presence of something deeper, something quieter, something far more spacious approaching. Something it cannot control. That deeper presence is what awakens when the ego begins to fall asleep. This is why spiritual crises so often precede spiritual openings. Moments of fear, confusion, frustration, or loss are not signs that you are going backward. They are signs that the ego's strategies are no longer working, that its grip is weakening, that its walls are becoming transparent. But the ego does not understand transparency. It only understands survival. So it fights. It fights with thoughts. You must hold on. You must protect yourself. You must win. You must not change. It fights with emotion. Fear, anger, defensiveness, urgency. It fights with distraction, with judgment, with blame, with the endless attempt to control what cannot be controlled. But what is truly fascinating, and perhaps a little amusing, is that every time the ego fights harder, it is not actually growing stronger. It is revealing its weakness. It is revealing the cracks in its foundation. It is revealing that its entire structure depends on constant effort. And what needs constant effort cannot possibly be your true nature. Your true nature, the deeper essence of what you are, does not strain to exist. It does not push, it does not pull, it does not insist. It simply is. It is effortless, like the way a flower blooms or the way a cloud drifts across the sky. The ego is the effort. The self is the ease. Now, this does not mean that the ego must be destroyed. Not at all. In fact, attempts to destroy the ego only strengthen it, because the very act of trying to destroy the ego is done by the ego. No, the ego must simply be understood. To understand something is to stop fighting it. And when you stop fighting the ego, it begins to relax. And when it relaxes, it naturally becomes transparent. And through that transparency, life shines through. But before the relaxation comes the resistance. Think of a knot in a rope. If you've ever tried to untangle a tight knot, you'll know that the moment you begin to loosen it, it first tightens. That is simply the nature of knots. both in ropes and in minds. The tension we feel in life, this tightening, this fear, this desperate grasping, is a knot preparing to unwind. It is the ego tightening before it releases. You see, the ego has one job, to keep the illusion of separateness intact. To tell you, you are this and not that. You are here and not everywhere. You are the thinker and not the thought. You are the doer and not the doing. This separation is not wrong. It is part of the game. It allows you to navigate a world of distinctions, of choices, of experiences. But it becomes painful the moment you believe it too deeply, the moment you forget it is a role you are playing. And so the ego fears sleep because sleep is a taste of non-separation. In deep sleep, there is no I. There is no boundary. There is no ego, no self-image, no story. There is only the effortless presence of being. An awakening, spiritual awakening, is very much like discovering that same spaciousness while awake. The ego senses this, and it trembles. It feels the horizon widening. It feels the edges of its identity dissolving. It feels the movement of something vast approaching, something it cannot comprehend. And so, just before awakening, the ego often becomes louder, more anxious, more controlling, more dramatic. It is not failing. It is completing its role. It is going to sleep. And if you watch carefully, you will notice that the moments of greatest inner struggle are often followed by moments of profound clarity. The nights of doubt are followed by mornings of insight. The crises of identity are followed by the emergence of a deeper, calmer self that doesn't need to prove anything. The ego fights hardest right before it falls asleep. Because what awakens in its place is infinitely more spacious, infinitely more peaceful, and infinitely more true than anything the ego could ever imagine. The ego does not die. It simply rests. And when it rests, you awaken. And so, let us look more closely at this peculiar moment, this threshold where the ego begins to loosen its grip. Many people imagine that awakening will arrive as a gentle breeze, a soft illumination, a peaceful expansion. And sometimes, yes, it does. But more often than not, awakening first appears as discomfort. Because it is uncomfortable to outgrow a self you have spent your whole life believing in. Imagine a hermit crab living inside a shell that once fit perfectly. It moved with ease, it felt protected and defined. But eventually the crab grows, and the shell begins to pinch. Now, nothing is wrong, the crab is simply ready for a larger space. Yet the process feels frightening because, to move into the next shell, the crab must leave the old one behind. In that brief moment, it is exposed. Human beings feel the same way when the ego begins to thin. You feel exposed. Vulnerable. Uncertain. Something inside you knows that the old shell no longer fits, but the new shell is not yet visible. And so the ego trembles, trying desperately to convince you that staying in the cramped, painful, suffocating shell is safer than stepping into the open. This trembling, this is the ego fighting. And it fights because it believes it is protecting you. It believes that without its constant commentary, without its endless opinions and judgments, without its ceaseless attempts to control life, you will collapse into chaos. But look closely, is this true? Has the ego ever succeeded in controlling life? Has it ever managed to guarantee security, or certainty, or permanence? Has it ever been able to hold the world still? You see, the ego's battle is not against chaos, it is against reality. And reality always wins. The ego is like a wave trying to control the ocean. It rises, it swells, it crashes, but the ocean remains untouched. Every moment the ego believes it is steering the ship, yet it is the ocean that carries everything. When the ego starts to recognize its own limitation, when it begins to sense that it is not the captain but merely a ripple in something vast, it becomes frightened. Threatened. And so it grows defensive. But this defensiveness is the sign of awakening, not decline. Because who is it that notices the ego fighting? Who is it that watches the fear arise? Who is it that sees the thoughts become frantic? That watcher is not the ego. There is something in you that observes the ego without being caught in it. Something that hears the mind's frantic arguments yet remains unmoved. Something that sees fear rise and fall like weather. This silent observer is not achieved through practice or belief, it is already here. It has always been here. The ego fights because it feels this presence. But the presence does not fight back, it simply watches. Now, what happens when something is fighting, and the opponent refuses to engage? The fight becomes pointless. The tension has nothing to push against. The energy exhausts itself. That is what allows the ego to fall asleep. Not force. Not suppression. Not denial. But observation. Observation is the great dissolver. Not because it destroys the ego, but because it reveals that the ego was never the real you in the first place. To watch the ego is to outgrow it. It is like watching a child throw a tantrum. The child believes the world is ending because they cannot have the toy they want. Their emotions surge, their voice rises, and yet you, an adult, see the situation with clarity. You don't hate the child for being upset. You simply understand that the child's perspective is limited. This is how your deeper awareness relates to your ego. The ego is not evil, it is simply young. It is a necessary developmental stage. It helped you function in the world, build an identity, navigate relationships, learn the rules of the game. But it is not the game. It is not the player. And it is not the field on which the game is played. It is simply one lens, one way of seeing. And every lens eventually becomes too small. You see, the ego thrives on boundaries. It needs to know where you end and where everything else begins. It needs opposition, conflict, something to push against. And so it creates the idea of an external world that is fundamentally separate from the internal self. But this division exists only in thought. Not in reality. The ego cannot survive without conflict. It needs friction to define itself. It needs problems to solve. It needs enemies to resist. It needs identity to defend. And so, when awakening approaches, when the observer within you begins to sense that the boundaries are dissolving, the ego believes it is being erased. It is not being erased. It is being returned to its proper place, like a tool placed back onto a shelf. But just as a child clings to a worn-out toy, the ego clings to its old identity. It cannot imagine a world in which it is not the center of attention. And so it intensifies. It becomes dramatic. It invents crises. It retells old stories. It tries to convince you that without it, you would not exist at all. This is the ego's final illusion. If I stop thinking about myself, I will disappear. But notice something. Every night, you disappear into deep sleep, and yet you do not die. Every night, the ego dissolves completely, and yet you awaken refreshed. You do not fight to remain you when you sleep. You allow yourself to fall into nothing. And that nothing feels like peace. Awakening is learning how to touch that same peace while fully conscious. It is learning how to rest without collapsing. How to be without defending. How to let go without losing anything. The ego fights hardest right before it falls asleep because it is approaching the boundary of its usefulness. It senses a shift, a change in the center of gravity, a movement from the tightness of identification to the spaciousness of being. You cannot force this shift. You cannot rush it. You cannot engineer it through willpower. You can only notice it. And in that noticing, something beautiful happens. A new kind of intelligence awakens. A new kind of listening emerges. A new kind of freedom begins to unfold. Not the freedom of the ego, the freedom to define, to control, to protect, but the freedom of awareness itself, open, receptive, effortless, unconflicted. And when that freedom begins to bloom, the ego naturally grows quiet. It relaxes like a tired child leaning against a parent. It trusts the silence because it senses something deeper holding it. It falls asleep. And you awaken. As you begin to taste this deeper awareness, something subtle yet extraordinary unfolds. You notice that life is no longer something happening to you. It is something flowing through you. And when life flows through you, without resistance, everything becomes lighter, not because the world has changed, but because the one who was clinging to the world has softened. You begin to see that the ego's struggle was never a sign of failure. It was a sign of nearing transformation. Just as a snake becomes restless before shedding its skin, the ego becomes restless before yielding to a larger sense of self. But let us look even more carefully at this yielding. Because the ego does not simply fade away like a ghost. It folds gently into the rhythm of existence. It becomes one instrument in a vast orchestra. It stops trying to conduct the symphony and begins to play its part. This is where the dance becomes beautiful. Have you ever watched a leaf floating on a river? It does not resist the current, nor does it guide it. It is carried. Effortlessly. Gracefully. It does not hurry, it does not delay. It does not cling to the banks or resist the bends of the river. It simply moves with the whole. When the ego relaxes, you become like that leaf, not passive, but aligned. Not aimless, but free. Not empty, but spacious. You see, the ego believes that surrender means defeat. But surrender is not giving up, it is giving in, to life, to flow, to the natural intelligence that moves all things. A flower does not bloom by effort. A wave does not rise by strain. A child does not grow by force. And you, too, are carried by the same effortless intelligence. When the ego falls asleep, you begin to trust this intelligence. Not as a belief, but as a direct experience. You trust the breath as it moves in and out on its own. You trust the heartbeat that never asks your permission. You trust the earth beneath your feet without checking if it will hold you. You trust the unfolding of the moment without needing to predict it. This trust is not something you create. It emerges naturally when the ego stops shouting long enough for you to hear what silence is saying. Silence has always been speaking. You were simply listening to the wrong voice. Now notice this, the ego does not disappear permanently. It comes and goes like weather. Some days it is cloudy, some days it is clear. Some days the ego is soft, and some days it is tense. This is perfectly natural. The goal is not to abolish the ego, but to stop confusing it with who you are. A thought is not the thinker. A feeling is not the feeler. An identity is not the one who wears it. Just as you can change a pair of shoes, you can also change a sense of self. The ego is a useful tool, like a pair of shoes that protect your feet as you walk across the terrain of the world. But shoes are not your feet. An identity is not your essence. When you forget this, the ego becomes heavy. When you remember it, the ego becomes light. And the remembering happens naturally, spontaneously, when you begin to trust the awareness beneath thought. Now, this shift is not always comfortable. In fact, the moments before clarity can feel like disorientation. You may feel lost, uncertain, groundless, as if the familiar structure of life is dissolving. But let us look closely at this feeling of being lost. Who is it that feels lost? What part of you is frightened? What part of you is clinging? It is never the deeper awareness that feels lost. Awareness cannot be lost because it has no position to lose. Only the ego feels lost, because the boundaries that define it are fading. To be lost from the ego's perspective is often to be found from the perspective of awareness. You feel lost only when you step out of the map the ego drew for you. But that map was never accurate. It was based on fear, habit, memory, and social conditioning. It was full of assumptions about who you must be and how life must unfold. When you step off this map, the ego cries, danger. But the heart whispers, freedom. You see, the deeper self does not need a map because it is not traveling from one point to another. It is already home. It is already complete. It is already whole. What the ego interprets as disintegration is often integration at a higher level. Just as a caterpillar dissolves inside its cocoon, its old form breaking down into formlessness before becoming a butterfly, the human sense of self sometimes dissolves into confusion before expanding into clarity. But the caterpillar is never in danger. It is simply becoming what it was meant to be. And you, too, are in a constant state of becoming. Not becoming something else, but becoming more fully what you already are. When the ego fights hardest, it is because the transformation is close. The cocoon is thinning. The new form is emerging. The space is widening. And something remarkable begins to happen. You start to notice that the thoughts you once believed were you are simply passing weather. The emotions you once took personally are simply movements of energy. The fears you once obeyed are echoes of old memories. The judgments you once clung to are shadows cast by outdated beliefs. The ego begins to lose its authority because you stop feeding it your attention. You see, what you attend to grows strong. What you ignore withers. What you observe without identification transforms. In this quiet transformation, a new way of being emerges, one that is spacious, fluid, intuitive. You begin to move through the world not as a rigid identity but as a living presence. You respond to life rather than react to it. You listen deeply rather than defend constantly. You feel more and fear less. And the ego, sensing this shift, struggles not because it is dying but because it is evolving. Its role changes. It becomes a servant rather than a master. It becomes a tool rather than a tyrant. It becomes a voice rather than a cage. And when the ego stops trying to control everything, it begins to collaborate with life. It stops shouting. And starts listening. It stops grasping. And starts flowing. It stops fearing. And starts resting. In this rest, in this quiet, in this gentle yielding, the ego finally experiences its true purpose, not as the center of existence, but as a participant in a far greater mystery. It falls asleep. Into the arms of awareness. And in its sleep, you awaken. As this awakening deepens, you begin to notice another strange and wonderful phenomenon. Life no longer feels like a series of battles to win or problems to solve. Instead, it begins to resemble a kind of unfolding, an organic movement, like the opening of a flower or the turning of the tide. There is a rhythm to it, a pulse, a flow. And you find yourself relaxing into that flow more and more. Because the ego is no longer gripping the wheel with white knuckles. You're not trying to control the moment, you are participating in it. You are not managing life, you are meeting it. You are not pushing the river, you are floating with it. This is what happens when the ego falls asleep. Not unconsciousness, but a shift in the center of gravity. You move from effort to ease. From contraction to expansion. From fear to curiosity. From resistance to receptivity. Let me tell you a little secret that is not really a secret at all. Life has always been trying to help you awaken. Every struggle, every loss, every unexpected change, these were not punishments or failures. They were invitations. Invitations to see where you were holding on too tightly, where you were believing too small, where you were confusing yourself with a story that had outlived its usefulness. But the ego does not see invitations. It sees threats. When someone leaves, the ego says, I am not enough. When plans fall apart, the ego says, I am losing control. When life changes direction, the ego says, something is wrong. Yet the deeper awareness whispers. Something is opening. You see, the ego interprets life through the lens of fear, but awareness interprets life through the lens of possibility. The ego says, protect yourself. Awareness says, trust yourself. The ego says, hold on. Awareness says, let go. The ego says, fight. Awareness says, flow. When the ego is dominant, every discomfort feels like danger. But when awareness begins to shine through, discomfort feels like growth. You can sense that a deeper intelligence is rearranging your life, not for your suffering, but for your expansion. And so the ego fights. Because it cannot imagine expansion. It only knows repetition. It tries to bring the past into the future, as if life should never surprise you. It tries to fit the infinite into a small box called identity. It tries to freeze the fluidity of existence into a concept. But existence was never meant to be frozen. It moves. It shifts. It dances. You are part of this dance. You always were. But the ego, like a child who wants to control the music, kept trying to lead. Now, with the ego softening, you begin to feel the dance more clearly. There is a sense of timing, of synchronicity, of effortless rightness. Things begin to happen without strain. Conversations align. Opportunities appear. Intuitions sharpen. You begin to feel guided, even though no one is guiding you. It is the natural intelligence of life moving without the distortion of fear. You begin to respond to life the way a musician responds to music, not by controlling every note, but by listening closely and moving in harmony with what you hear. This is the deepest form of surrender. Not resignation, but participation. Not passivity, but presence. Not losing yourself, but finding a self that is larger than anything the ego could conceive. In this state, something extraordinary happens. Your relationship with fear changes completely. Fear no longer feels like an enemy. Instead, it feels like a signal, an invitation to look more deeply. You begin to notice that fear arises precisely at the boundary between the known and the unknown. And rather than retreating, you begin to step forward with curiosity. Fear becomes a doorway. Uncertainty becomes a teacher. The unknown becomes a friend. Because you are no longer navigating life as a frightened ego trying to survive. You are navigating from awareness, vast, spacious, grounded. And from this awareness, you begin to see that the ego's nightmare, its greatest fear, is actually your liberation. What is that fear? The fear of not knowing who you are. The ego depends on definitions. I am this type of person. I have this history. I want these things. I must avoid that. But what if you don't know who you are? What if you cannot be defined? What if your essence is not a fixed shape, but an open space? To the ego, this sounds terrifying. To awareness, this is freedom. Because anything that can be defined is limited. Anything that can be named can be boxed. Anything that can be conceptualized can be mistaken for something it is not. You are not a concept. You are not a story. You are not an identity. You are the open space in which all identities appear and disappear. You are the silence in which all thoughts rise and fall. You are the awareness behind every experience you've ever had. And when this realization begins to dawn, not as an idea, but as a living experience, the ego grows quiet. Not defeated. Not destroyed. But humbled. Humbled by the vastness of what you truly are. It stops pretending to be the whole sky and settles into being a passing cloud. It stops pretending to be the entire ocean and rests as a single wave. It stops pretending to be the center of existence and becomes what it was always meant to be, a useful, temporary expression of something infinitely larger. And in this humility, the ego becomes gentle. It becomes playful. It becomes light. It no longer needs to fight, because it is no longer afraid. It falls asleep. And in that sleep, a deeper intelligence awakens, an intelligence that moves you without effort, guides you without commands, and lives through you without conflict. In this awakening, you discover the truth that was hidden in plain sight. You were never the ego fighting for survival. You are the awareness watching the whole thing unfold. And now, my friends, we arrive at the quiet heart of the matter. When the ego finally rests, when its constant commentary fades into the background, you begin to sense something that has always been here, something so subtle and yet so utterly foundational that you may wonder how you ever overlooked it. A stillness. A presence. A spaciousness. Not an object you can observe, not a feeling you can describe, not a thought you can grasp, but the open field in which all thoughts, all feelings, all experiences arise. It is like realizing that you have spent your entire life looking at waves, studying waves, analyzing waves, fearing waves, and then, one day, you notice the ocean. And once you see the ocean, you cannot unsee it. The waves still move. They still rise and fall. They still splash and foam. But you know now that they are expressions of the ocean, not separate from it. They do not disturb the ocean's depth. They do not threaten its existence. They are its play. Your thoughts are waves. Your emotions are waves. Your ego is a wave. You are the ocean. This realization does not happen as a dramatic explosion of enlightenment, it happens as a remembering. A soft recognition. A gentle homecoming. You return to the place you never left, because you finally stopped trying to be somewhere else. The ego's struggle was always an attempt to escape the present moment, yet the present moment is the only place where anything real has ever happened. When the ego quiets, you rediscover the simplicity of now. Not the now of mindfulness technique, not the now people try to achieve by effort, but the natural now, the effortless now, the ever-present now. The now that does not need to be cultivated because it is the only thing that has ever existed. Everything you experience happens here. Everything you fear happens in imagination. Everything you regret happens in memory. Everything you hope for happens in projection. But life, actual life, happens now. And only awareness can meet the now. The ego cannot, because the ego is made of time. It is woven from past and future. It is a story about who you were and who you think you must become. When the ego sleeps, time softens. The past loosens its grip. The future stops demanding your obedience. And the present moment reveals itself as vast, luminous, alive. You begin to live in a different way. Not by planning every step, but by listening to the quiet intuition that arises from stillness. Not by forcing outcomes, but by responding to the unfolding of life with an open heart. Not by clinging to certainty, but by trusting the intelligence that moves all things, even when you cannot predict where it will lead. This trust is not blind. It is not naive. It is not resignation. It is the natural trust of a wave resting in the ocean. It is the trust of a tree rooted in the earth, reaching upward without fear of falling. It is the trust of a bird leaping into the air, knowing instinctively that the air will hold it. It is the trust of a child who has not yet learned to doubt the world. When the ego sleeps, trust returns, not as a belief, but as a direct knowing. You are held. You are carried. You are part of something vast and intelligent and deeply harmonious. Even the difficulties become meaningful. Even the losses become openings. Even the endings become beginnings. You no longer see life as a threat, but as a teacher. You no longer see change as danger, but as transformation. You no longer see yourself as separate, but as participating in a great, unfolding mystery. And in this mystery, something sacred awakens within you. Not religious in the traditional sense, not tied to doctrine or dogma, but a sacredness that arises from the simple recognition of being alive, being aware, being here. A sacredness that cannot be named, only lived. It appears in the quiet moments. In the way sunlight filters through a window. In the sound of breath entering and leaving your body. In the stillness between thoughts. In the movement of emotion rising and falling like a tide. It appears in laughter. In tears. In silence. It appears most clearly when you stop trying to grasp it. Because you cannot grasp what you already are. This is the final paradox. The ego fights hardest right before it falls asleep. Because the moment it relaxes. You awaken to the simple truth. That you were never the ego to begin with. You were the awareness behind it. You were the space around it. You were the witness of its rise and fall, its dramas and triumphs, its fears and fantasies. The ego was a character in your dream of being separate. Awareness is the one who wakes up. And when you wake up, nothing changes. And yet everything changes. You still live your life, but you are no longer trapped in it. You still play your roles, but you are no longer defined by them. You still feel emotions, but you no longer drown in them. You still experience thoughts, but you are no longer owned by them. You move through the world lightly, fluidly, peacefully. Because you are no longer resisting what is. Life becomes less of a struggle. And more of a dance. A dance between form and emptiness. Between self and no self. Between doing and being. Between the wave and the ocean. And you discover, perhaps with a smile, that the ego was never your enemy. Only a child learning to sleep. While the vastness of your true nature watches over it. So let it fight. Let it tremble. Let it resist. And let it rest. Because when the ego falls asleep, you awaken to the spaciousness, the stillness, the profound and luminous presence that has always been your true home.